So with that, I'd like to invite our wonderful panelists back to the stage, if you would, and we will open it up for your questions. Do we share this or no?
They're all mic'd up there, so.
Great. So
You can either use, yeah.
All right. Do I get a seat there? Okay, great.
Can you want the middle?
No, I'll sit on the end. No, it's easier. Okay. Okay, questions from the audience. This is your chance. We have one? Oh, great. Thank you. Camille. Where does the destruction of the identification role stop as to not destroy social ties? Chris? Actually, can you unpack that idea? Actually, I would love you to unpack that the term, the identification role here. I was curious about that myself.
I think what is meant by that is the fact that most of our identity now is tied towards forms of identification, right? So the identification role and identity are a little bit different. So what, at least anonymous in the passage that I put out there, I'm talking towards somebody who I don't know asked this question, sorry.
Raise your hands, you're not anonymous.
It's fine, you get to be anonymous. There's a difference between identification and identity. And identity, if it is a collective process, why then are we privatizing more and more this notion of identity? So this is the sort of discrepancy that I'm interested in. Why is it that we become much more individualistic when data is involved in our identification process, right? And that sort of treats us more and more as individuals when in fact identity isn't something that is an individual process. Yeah?
But what role money in this, in the production of this, which is there's a production and then a consumption.
Yes, yes. And I feel bad because I've just been teaching this, so I have a student out there. Sorry. I think that financialization and identification processes go together. So yes, money has something to do with this. Think about how we go into a bank. We need to identify ourselves with social security cards. We need to give our mother's maiden names, etc. We give very personal information to the financial practices. And these two things have sort of coexisted and come together. The more we identify ourselves has to do with securing the identity that's a financial one.
But how about, has that changed at all with sort of these e-cash alternatives like Bitcoin?
Yeah, they just went bankrupt, the two banks, right? I think that those things will certainly be the future, that those are about encryption and also about security and securing your identity and securing your financial records.
Right. Although there was an idea, which I remember when talking about the cash aspect, because the cash is essentially, what I was told is anonymous, right? That you can use cash without revealing identity.
Right.
And so that's why the search or the appeal of this kind of e-cash still remains. And I think you're right, though. It is in most cases it's tied to identity. Okay.
Somebody besides me.
Somebody besides you. All right. Let you off the hook. Okay, I think this is Colin. What's the distinction between hacktivism and the NSA? Does politics separate the two?
Yeah, so I think it is increasingly blurry, at least at the level of practice, what distinguishes a number of security agencies, national or private, and hacktivist groups or individual hacktivists. I think they are, in many cases, using identical tactics and identical practices. Often they're political, as the question suggests. Their political agendas are quite different, at least in principle or as far as we understand them. Long-term goals, perhaps, if we think about their political agendas in that way. But I think if we imagine their practices not only in terms of actual technical facility, but also the way in which they carry out their organizational behaviors or figure out their relationship with other organizations or with other technical professionals and so forth, we see a very similar ethos as well as a similar tactic. So there's a tremendous amount of pleasure involved and also simultaneously mapped onto this kind of militarized language of security culture in general, and those things are quite similar between the two different camps. They have a shared ethos of fun and pleasure and outwitting the opponent and conquering, etc. But also I think I get a sense in studying these communities that there's also a tremendous amount of respect when they play by the same rules. So even though they may end up in kind of an arms race with each other, as long as the playing field is on the level of technical ability and sophistication, even when one may pwn the other, it's not a sense of a violation of some kind of ethical norm as much as it is a sense of kind of that was how the game was supposed to be played. Where the outrage happens and then where the political difference comes is when a non-technical solution is found or when some other workaround to the level playing field. For example, when legislative apparatus comes in, lawsuits, etc. Even then when the tremendous forces that security agencies or national security may have in comparison to hacktivists, then that often will seem a bit unfair, and then that provokes concern and often retaliatory actions on the part of hacktivists. So this is all just to say, I think it is increasingly blurry, and even when we come to ask the question of what are the politics, it's not always homogeneous on both sides. It's a very, very heterogeneous and confusing field, which is why my answer isn't entirely clear on this.
Thanks, Scott. I mean, speaking of the idea of this blurring and the sort of ambiguity between surveillance and surveillance, maybe, Kate, you could talk about the sort of availability or consumerization of drone technology. How is that changing the landscape?
Could you phrase that again, Ken?
Well, it's just that there's a number of for example, the quad-rotor drones are becoming available. I saw one that comes out of China that's just $100, and it's about the size of this, like a pack of cigarettes. And the price of these are going to drop. So now these are going to be extremely widely available. And I'm just curious how that changes the equation.
Well, but I think what's interesting about this is that the sort of hobby culture associated with technologies, pilotless planes, has a really long history. And so there's a sort of interesting back and forth in terms of military technology. Some of the earliest drones emerged out of model planes as simultaneous to be emerging within the military, and this was happening in the 1930s and 1940s. And so I'm interested in the longer narratives and the way in which those technologies, this kind of difference between high and low tech, maybe is already a problematic distinction. And right now you can easily build your own drone if you have some understanding of Arduino and a model airplane, which is even cheaper than the sort of the ones, whatever ones are coming out for $100 or even cheaper. I mean, there's technologies using hot air balloons or simply helium balloons that have been used by artists in order to do aerial surveillance photographs. So simultaneous with technologies that cost millions, billions of dollars to develop, there's other tactics that are happening at the same time. And I wonder how we can think about, first, moving beyond this kind of high-tech, low-tech, failed, not failed systems, and what does the aesthetics of all of these different technologies do? And I'm interested in what people are doing with their drone that they buy for $100. It seems really interesting. What I've seen is everything from great surf photographs that seem to be really important as kind of panoptic landscape scenes. There's James Brightell's Dronestagram, but then there's another site that apparently doesn't know about Brightell's Dronestagram that's called Dronestagram, and those are people who really want to show their landscape photographs that they have collected on their drone cameras. And so there's this kind of multiplicity that is happening through these images, which it produces a kind of fragmenting that I think really challenges some of these panoptic ideas that are associated with surveillance. And I think that saw that in everyone's talk. There's a kind of fracturing that's happening simultaneous to this idea of this kind of optics of panopticon. And I wonder a lot about that fracturing and what possibilities happen in those fracturings. And I think that kind of brings these different talks together.
You could call it kaleidoscopic, and then you
Right.
can see how that justifies then why recently a court case was passed that it's okay to take a camera not from above, but exposes the fact that you can now do an underskirt camera and it's legal. so that it's exploring aerial and this kind of aerification at the same time. It allows a growth, an exponential growth in all the directions. I don't know if it's only fracturing. There's this great quality for your talk that deals with, we didn't get into, but it's interesting, the notion of light and what role light plays, or the absence of, even in the representation of black hats versus white hats, whereas where I live, Chaos Computer Club, they're all white hats. They'll only say white hat. They'll only talk about the light and enlightenment versus something else, at least publicly. That's that. This is exponential growth, and all cameras become viable.
And I mean, even the Google Glasses to me seems a little bit about this multiple optics at the same time, right? Like you have your eyes as this lens, and then there's another lens, as I understand it, and that seems to be part of what you're interested in, this Heimlich.
This doubling, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Julia, maybe on this, Kate just mentioned the aesthetics, and I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about some of your influences, artistic influences, in terms of, let's say, historically around the ideas of surveillance. What's influenced you in the past?
Well, in terms of going, if we trace just Google Glass, I think the experience with Steve Mann in 1995 when he walked from MIT to Mass College of Art, and his eyes were black. Now, you all know that Doberman dogs have their ears clipped and their tails severed in order that you can't tell what they're thinking, you can't tell what they know. And it was the same, perhaps the Google Glasses, they put a little light in there or something, it's not so weird, but this darkness, this visage of a man who could not be known, the unknown, even though we knew who he was because his shirt said MIT, this unknown because of the eye is one role tracing of that. Josh Oppenheimer from Harvard was in that class at that time, and after Steve came, we did massive interrogations of everyone in the class, and that's on tape. But that's one thread. In terms of projections and social space, there's, Boys is very influenced the social character of artistic practice, but also the threads of Gary T. Marks, who was also at MIT, and his writing on, of course, the Maximum Security Society. And I went out to do projects that detailed each one of his 6 sub-societies, actuarial, predictive, dossier societies that he found in the 80s. But the way you've taken the dissonance and brought it to a wider sphere is particularly unusual, that this uncanny is uncovered. The uncanny of the black guy is in engineering and in art. This is, we're lucky to be here. This is a very unusual kind of exposure which deals with the repressed.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. Another question for you, Julia. How can artists push the visibility of intervention beyond the gallery? Is the gallery still a relevant space?
The gallery is a super interesting place. The examples I gave were projects that don't go to the gallery, which is why I gave them. Plus, the students all donated their works. I said, do you want your work presented in this context? And those projects were grabbed because they said, oh yeah, you can show my work. There are more and more galleries being guilted out for not showing the whole range of works, that they want to be identified with the social space, social conditions, and the problematic of survival is a bold one. They're reaching out. So I like galleries, but it's not, it's a kind of glove, which I think many artists or cultural producers appreciate. A safe haven, or a nomad helper, a ship, ein Schiff. A gallery is also something else. It is a place where interesting discussion emerges as a result of a work being brought in there, no matter what the kind of work it is.
And it's also interesting that galleries and museums are always one of the most surveilled spaces. I mean, if you cannot go and observe art without being watched very closely, both with cameras and bodies by guards.
There's a great artist who loves microgravity, Bradley Pitts, who went up in the BARF plane, and he, like astronauts, was one of the most surveilled artists. So you do have increasingly artists engaging surveillance mechanism as a mode of recording and digestion of current technotopics.
Thank you. Chris, maybe you could say a few words about Raphael and your project with his work.
So like you, I've been working on the digital uncanny. Yet I don't want to sort of pose it as something simply visual. I think that there's also, sound qualities and other things that go with it. Raphael, I got interested in his work because he did these large installation pieces in the UK in which he projected, and you showed the image, these video images that were video portraitures of moving images in people's shadows. So he used surveillance technologies to sort of trace people's movement within public space, and then found out where they were going, and in their shadow projected a portrait that would wake up if you stopped and make a gesture, which really freaked people out. So what I was interested in, and what I'm interested in with the digital uncanny, is sort of counter to Freud. Freud really wants to disassociate the uncanny with the technological, and I want to rethink the uncanny as something that's anticipating the human. And the fact that a lot of these technologies can anticipate our movements and gestures and desires, etc., sort of places it back to rethink about what Freud is doing. But you're right, Freud was deeply paranoid about being watched, but that was when he was in the red light district, right? Himself.
Right,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Is that paranoid, though?
He was paranoid that somebody saw him keep coming back to them.
But he was excited, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, but no one says paranoia is not exciting. But actually the audio, I'm glad you brought the audio back, because Julia brought that up, and so much of your work brings the audio in, Julia, that we were talking about the uncanny of the audio effect, and something like Siri, I think, starts to push that boundary, where Siri's voice and those kind of voices that come out of these new kind of direction, guidance tools, etc., have this uncanniness to them as well in the audio realm. So I agree with you. It's certainly not limited to visual. Julia?
I was just attracted to your wonderful device here, which I have something to say about on the audio aspect, that Noam Chomsky himself has noted that there's a lot of control in audio, how you dictate control to people with audio, and that there is a lot of improvisation due to I'm quoting, due to semantics and linguistic variation. And I find that very exciting, and that the commentary that comes when someone goes to his work and sees a body on the ground is a linguistic response. It's not so much this embodied, but it's coming out with, oh, look at who's there.
Yeah, it's a little of both. Yeah.
Okay, yes.
Add something to that. Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting in the history of drone technologies is the way in which we frame them often in terms of the visual, and I'm working through them in the terms of the visual. But those visual terms are related to electronic and signals intelligence over and over again, and the way in which we might think about the drone as processing what we would define as visual is information for the machine system. And in that system, what is electronic, what is signals, what is visual are all sort of interconnected and brought together. And I think that is a real challenge for us in terms of thinking about what is surveillance. We often think about it as humans in terms of this visual idea of surveillance. And I think particularly the digital technologies, but even earlier machine and signals surveillance, all use different modes of watching which are not visual at all, and instead really encompass all these other modes of sensing.
Good. No, I think we've talked about surveillance and surveillance, but there's a word that doesn't seem to have picked up much traction, of covalence. And I'm curious about that. And just, we only have another couple minutes, but someone had a question had come in about another form of this, which is self-surveillance, the selfie. Does this fit within this discourse?
Yeah, I would say it fits quite well, particularly even in thinking about the uncanny and the political efficacy that we might imagine around uncanny effects of media, insofar as the uncanny, as we've been suggesting, is not so much an exposure of information, but the recognition that something is being hidden and it could be exposed, or is in the process of becoming exposed. And it's this pure affect, this unprocessed recognition of something to be known. And that seems to be really what's at stake with processes of self-surveillance or the quantified self-movement and so forth, is the recognition that there is something inherently unknowable about yourself unless you're constantly producing yourself in the form of media or reproducing yourself in these variety of scattered ways as a multiplicity and a distributed networked self that never actually is able to get at that thing which is your own essence. And so it performs the uncanniness of one's own being in the very act of taking that selfie. And so I think we really start to get the sense in which we now, thinking about going back to Chris's original articulation around the destruction of the identification process or identification principle, it actually performs that in taking the selfie. We are now drawn to recognize that we are not ourselves. Even if we identify ourselves, we are always distributed beings.
Yeah, but how come the dialogue is so different now that we have a word for it? It's no longer just narcissistically taking your own picture. Because for me, the dialogue shifted. If you did a print on a video printer and endlessly made your own picture, it was just all about you. Now, the language, and that's why I think Noam's discourse is so interesting on this, it acquires a vast new field. Plus, there's product placement as well.
Plus, there's
So-
live streaming and things like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is almost equated with.
That brings us right back to Google Glass. Perfect. All right, on that note, thank you all very much.